The laughter started before the attorney even finished reading. Mayor Calloway heard it the moment the words left Gerald Whitmore's mouth. A soft, barely contained snicker from her Uncle Philip, followed by a low, conspiratorial murmur from her cousins seated in the front row. They didn't even bother to hide it. Why would they? In their minds, the outcome of this meeting had been decided long before any of them walked through the polished, mahogany doors of Whitmore and Associates. Maya sat in the very last chair of the conference room, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched. She was wearing the nicest thing she owned, a dark green blouse she had ironed that morning with a faulty iron that kept spitting steam. Around her, the Calloway family wore another world entirely. Her cousin Derek had his Italian leather shoes propped casually against the edge of his chair. His mother, Aunt Sylvia, wore a cream blazer that probably cost more than Maya's monthly rent. For the past 4 years, Maya had driven 2.5 hours every single weekend to sit beside her grandfather, Edmund Calloway, in the memory care facility outside of Harrisburg. She had read him newspaper articles when his eyesight failed. She had held his hand through the confusion and the fear of his final months. She had been there quietly and without recognition when nobody else showed up. Edmund's other children and grandchildren had been too busy, too important, too far away, too wrapped up in their own lives to make the drive. Maya had never asked for anything in return. She hadn't done it for money. She had done it because she was the only one who actually loved the old man for who he was, not for what he was worth. And yet, sitting in that conference room, she felt foolish forever, thinking that love translated into anything legally binding. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat and continued down the document. The estate was staggering. Edmund Calloway had built Calloway Industrial Supplies from a single warehouse in Pittsburgh into a regional empire with contracts across 6 states. He had been careful, quiet, and ruthlessly private about his wealth. Nobody in the family knew the true extent of it. Until now, Derek inherited the controlling stake in the company. 43% of all shares, enough to run the board with minimal opposition. Aunt Sylvia received the primary family home in Chestnut Hill, a property appraised at $2.8 million, along with a liquid disbursement of $1.5 million. Other relatives collected stock portfolios, investment accounts, vacation properties. One cousin, Maya, had met exactly twice received a classic car collection worth $500,000. Maya waited. Finally, Whitmore looked up. His eyes carried the particular kind of sympathy that attorneys develop when they have to deliver bad news dressed up as good news. "And to my granddaughter, Maya Calloway," Whitmore read carefully. "Who gave me her, time when time was all I had left, I leave the Dunmore Road property, the structure, and the land in full." Silence, then Derek let out a long, low whistle. "Dunmore Road," he said, turning to his mother with barely concealed amusement. "Isn't that the old farmhouse? The one that's been sitting empty since, what, 2015? Sylvia pressed her lips together to suppress a smile. 2014, I believe. The roof collapsed in the back half. The county sent a notice about it 2 years ago. Structural violations. She turned and looked at Maya directly, her expression a masterpiece of false sympathy. "Oh, Maya. Sweetheart, I'm sure he meant well." More murmuring. A quiet, knowing laugh from somewhere near the window. Maya felt the heat rise from her chest to her throat. She kept her face perfectly still. "There is an addendum, Whitmore," said his voice, cutting through the noise. The room quieted. He adjusted his reading glasses and continued. In his own words, "Maya, the floor always held more than it showed. Don't be afraid to look beneath what others dismissed." Another beat of silence. Then Derek laughed outright, a full, rolling sound. "Very poetic, Grandpa," he said. "The floor held more than it showed. Maybe there's a family of raccoons living under it. At least you'll have company, Maya." Maya stood up. She did not cry. She did not argue. She picked up her canvas bag from the floor, nodded once at the attorney, and walked out of the room while her family's laughter followed her down the corridor, into the elevator, and out onto the grey afternoon street. She didn't go to the farmhouse right away. She spent 2 days sitting with the deed on her kitchen table, turning Edmund's words over and over in her mind. The floor always held more than it showed. Don't be afraid to look beneath what others dismissed. It didn't read like comfort. It read like instruction. On the 3rd morning, Maya loaded her car with a flashlight, a crowbar, work gloves, and a thermos of black coffee. She drove north out of the city, through rolling farmland and narrow county roads, until the GPS lost its signal entirely, and she navigated the last 4 miles from memory and a printed map. The Dunmore Road property was exactly as bad as she had feared. The farmhouse crouched at the end of a long, overgrown lane, half swallowed by untrimmed hedges and wild grass that had grown waist-high over a decade of neglect. The white paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wooden siding grey and weathered. A large section of the rear roof had folded inward, leaving the back rooms open to the sky. The front porch sagged severely to the left, and the front door stood ajar. Not from welcome, but from simple structural failure. Maya stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, looking at it. "Don't be afraid to look beneath what others dismissed," she repeated quietly. She pulled on her gloves and went inside. The interior smelled of damp wood, old dust, and something earthy and cold. What had once been a modest farmhouse kitchen was now a chaos of fallen plaster, water stains, and a thick carpet of dead leaves blown in through the broken windows. The living room beyond it was surprisingly intact. A large fieldstone fireplace dominated the far wall, floor to ceiling, its hearth cold and dark. The floors throughout were old oak hardwood, buckled and warped in most places from years of water damage and neglect. Maya spent the first hour simply clearing debris. She worked methodically, filling trash bags, pushing rubble to the edges of the room, sweeping grime from the floor with an old broom she found leaning in what had been the coat closet. Physical work steadied her. It always had. It was while she was sweeping near the fireplace that she noticed it. The broom caught, not on debris. She had already cleared the area. The bristles had snagged on something in the wood itself. Maya stopped and looked down. She crouched, brushing the remaining dust aside with her gloved hand. There was a line in the floor. A perfectly straight, deliberate cut running parallel to the fireplace, about 18 inches out from the hearthstone. She followed it with her finger. It turned a corner. Then another, a rectangle, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, framed in the old oak planking, invisible unless you were looking for it, unless you were on your hands and knees, sweeping, unless you weren't afraid to look. Maya's heart began to pound. She pressed her palm flat against the rectangle and knocked. A hollow, resonant thud answered her. She moved her hand outside the rectangle and knocked again. A dense, flat smack, solid subfloor. Back inside the rectangle, hollow, Maya retrieved the crowbar. The wood was swollen and stubborn. Years of moisture had pressed the panel tight into its housing. She wedged the flat end of the bar into the seam and leaned her full weight into it. Nothing. She repositioned and tried again, working the bar along the edge, tapping it in with her heel. On the 3rd attempt, with a shriek of old nails surrendering, the panel shifted. She moved quickly around the perimeter, prying and lifting until, with a final heavy crack, the oak rectangle came free. Maya pulled it aside and shone her flashlight into the cavity below. The space between the floor joists was deep and dry, insulated from below with packed clay that had kept the moisture out for decades. And resting there, secured between 2 joists with custom-cut wooden brackets, was a flat steel document safe. Not a lockbox, not a footlocker, a proper professional-grade fireproof document safe, the kind used in law offices and banks. It was secured with a 4-digit combination lock. Maya sat back on her heels and stared at it for a long moment. Then she thought of Edmund's hands, arthritic, trembling, but still deliberate, gripping hers during their long Sunday visits. She thought of the things he used to say when his mind was still sharp. The numbers he used to repeat when he was anxious, the way he'd count on his fingers. 4 numbers, always in the same order. She had assumed it was a nervous habit. She reached into the cavity, pressed the digits into the lock, and turned. The safe opened. Inside were 3 categories of documents, each separated by color-coded manila folders. The first folder contained a handwritten letter sealed with an old wax stamp. Edmund's personal seal, the one he used on formal correspondence. Maya broke it carefully and unfolded the single page inside. Maya, if you found this, it means you listened more carefully than anyone gave you credit for. I always knew you would. The contents of this safe are yours by right and by my deliberate intention, not as consolation, but as the truth I could not speak aloud while others were listening. What your uncle and your cousins believe they have inherited is a facade I built carefully over the last 6 years. Callaway Industrial Supplies is not the company it appears to be. In 2018, I discovered that Philip had been systematically diverting company funds through a network of shell vendors, false invoices, fictitious contracts, suppliers that existed only on paper. By my estimate, he took nearly $4 million over a period of 5 years. When I confronted him, he threatened to challenge my mental competencies and contest my estate. I was already showing early signs of decline. I knew I could not win that fight publicly, so I did something else. I documented everything. The second folder contains the complete paper trail of Philip's fraud, original invoices, bank routing records, correspondence, and a signed affidavit from my former CFO, Russell Hayne, who witnessed the scheme and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity arrangements I have already made on his behalf. The third folder is more important. It contains the deed to a separate property, a commercial warehouse on Elgin Street that I never disclosed to the estate, and that does not appear in any filing Philip's attorneys reviewed. I transferred it into a land trust 7 years ago under a name that cannot be connected to Callaway family assets without this deed. It is currently leased to 3 long-term commercial tenants and generates $18.400 per month in rental income. It is yours. Give my regards to Russell. He is expecting your call. I loved you without condition. I hope you know that now. Edmund Maya read the letter 3 times. Then she sat on the warped farmhouse floor in the cold and the quiet and cried, not from grief and not from relief, but from the specific, overwhelming sensation of being seen by someone who is no longer there to see you. She gave herself 24 hours. Then she made 2 phone calls. The first was to Russell Hayne, who picked up on the second ring and said, simply, I wondered how long it would take you to find it. Your grandfather said you'd need a day to sit with it first. He knew you well. The second call was to a forensic accountant named Constance Bell, who had spent 12 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division before going private. Maya had found her name through Russell. Constance did not waste time on pleasantries. Bring me the second folder, Constance said. If it's what you're describing, we won't need to do much. The documentation does the talking. They met the following morning. Constance spread the documents across a long work table in her office and studied them for nearly an hour without speaking. When she finally looked up, her expression was composed but decisive. This is exceptionally clean documentation, she said. The routing records alone are enough to establish the scheme. With the affidavit and the original invoice copies, this is not a civil matter. This is federal wire fraud and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. The amounts involved trigger mandatory sentencing guidelines. She paused. Your uncle has no idea this exists. None, Maya said, and he currently controls 43% of a company whose incoming audit will now uncover the financial irregularities he created. Yes. Constance leaned back in her chair. Then he didn't inherit a company. He inherited a trap that was already sprung. The federal inquiry opened quietly, the way serious investigations always do, not with sirens, but with paperwork, letters, requests for records. A forensic audit that Derek and Sylvia initially dismissed as routine. The kind of thing that happened to other people. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late to do anything about it. The morning the FBI agents arrived at Callaway Industrial Supplies' main office, Derek was in the middle of a meeting with a vendor he had no intention of paying. He looked up from the conference table and saw 3 agents in the doorway, and the expression on his face in that moment, the slow collapse of absolute certainty, was something his assistant would describe to colleagues for years afterward. Sylvia received her notice at the Chestnut Hill house she had already begun renovating. The property was subject to a freeze pending investigation of assets potentially connected to the fraud. The contractors were sent home. The credit cards were declined before she reached the end of the driveway. Within 6 weeks, every piece of visible wealth the Callaway heirs had celebrated in that conference room had been called into question, frozen, or flagged for seizure. Derek's attorney advised him that cooperation was his only meaningful option. Sylvia stopped returning calls from her social circle. The family that had laughed loudly and without hesitation at a condemned farmhouse and a woman in a steam-damaged blouse found themselves standing in the rubble of an empire that had never been as solid as they believed. They called Maya on a Thursday afternoon. Derek called first, from a number she didn't recognize, because his phone had been surrendered to investigators. He asked if they could meet. He said please, which Maya noted was a word she had never once heard him use in her direction. She agreed to meet them. She chose the time and the location. Maya arrived at the downtown office suite 10 minutes early. She was wearing a well-cut charcoal blazer she had purchased the previous week, the first genuinely good piece of clothing she had ever owned, and she carried a slim leather portfolio. She had slept well the night before for the first time in months. Derek and Sylvia arrived looking like people who had aged 5 years in 6 weeks. Derek's suit was the same expensive one he had worn to the will reading, but it sat differently on him now, as if he had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. Sylvia had come without her usual armor of salon polish and jewelry, and she looked, for the first time Maya could remember, like an ordinary person. Maya, Sylvia began, reaching across the table. We made mistakes, we know that, but family has to come first. Whatever you have, whatever Edmund left, we can figure this out together. Maya opened the portfolio and placed a single document on the table between them. It was a property summary, the Elgin Street warehouse, its tenants, its lease terms, its income. This is what Edmund left me, Maya said. Not the farmhouse. The farmhouse was a door. Derek stared at the numbers. His jaw tightened. That's part of the estate, he said, his voice carrying the last faint echo of his old authority. That should have been disclosed. You could be charged with, it was transferred into a protected land trust 7 years ago, Maya said calmly. Before the estate was filed, before any of us sat in that room, Edmund's attorney managed the transfer. It is fully legal and fully documented. You're welcome to have your attorney review the trust instrument. Silence. What do you want from us? Sylvia asked. Her voice was quiet now. Defeated, Maya considered the question for a moment. Nothing, she said. I don't want anything from you. I came here to tell you something, not to ask you for anything. She closed the portfolio. I want you to understand that what happened to you happened because Edmund saw clearly, even when people thought he couldn't see anymore. He watched. He documented. He planned, and he trusted me with the result, not because I was the smartest or the most powerful person in that conference room, but because I was the only one who showed up. She stood and picked up the portfolio. The lawyers and the federal investigators will handle the rest. I have a property manager to meet. She walked to the door, then paused. He asked me to give you a message, she said. She didn't turn around. He said, a family that cannot be trusted with someone's final years cannot be trusted with their legacy. She left them there. The farmhouse on Dunmore Road was demolished 6 months later, not by the county, but by Maya's own contractor. In its place, she broke ground on a small, well-designed residential structure on the 2 acres of land. She kept the fieldstone fireplace salvaged and rebuilt on the new foundation. It was the one thing in the original structure that had held firm against everything the years had thrown at it. The Elgin Street warehouse continued to produce its monthly income. Maya used the first year's revenue to clear what was left of her debt, establish a reserve fund, and quietly create a scholarship in Edmund Calloway's name for first-generation college students in the county, where he had started his first warehouse job at 17 years old. She did not attend Derek's sentencing hearing. She did not read about it afterward. She had already moved forward. On the day the new foundation was poured on Dunmore Road, Maya stood at the edge of the clearing where the old farmhouse had once slouched in its decay and looked at the clean concrete rectangle where something new would rise. The floor always held more than it showed. Edmund had known exactly what he was doing. He had left her not just a property and a trust, but a lesson, the kind that has to be discovered rather than told. That real things are often hidden, that the people who look past the surface, who are not deterred by mockery or dismissal, who kneel down and press their hands against the floor and listen for the hollow space beneath, those are the people who find what actually matters. Maya had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who judged surfaces. She had learned, in the end, to be grateful for it. It had taught her exactly where to look. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the person dismissed, overlooked, or handed something everyone else laughed at, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, when you found that hollow space in your own life, what was underneath it.